Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. My name is Dr. Brad Reedy, and tonight's an open forum. So that means any questions you have, any topics you want me to discuss, please submit them at any time. We have a few pre-submitted questions, and a couple of you have also submitted questions as we've been waiting to begin this evening. So I'll get to those. I'm going to read one that was sent to me personally from somebody who listens to the podcasts. And this is what this individual says. I don't know if it's appropriate in the context of your work, but I am very interested in hearing your thoughts about shame around sex, the shame we learn from parents or society, and how parents we can help our children to avoid that shame. So, and then she goes on to qualify kind of what her thinking is about. But I've been thinking about this because I got this a few days ago. Actually, told her I would address it on a podcast or a webinar live, and then give her the link to the podcast. It's one of the things that's predominant in our culture, that we feel so uncomfortable. It comes from our history, from our roots, that we feel uncomfortable around sex. And so there are, like a lot of things that we feel uncomfortable talking about that are passed down through shame. Even myself, who was trying not to pass on some of the ideas around shame that I inherited from my family of origin and from my culture, the culture I grew up in, even I would sometimes do what my wife and I call kind of play the sitcom father. When my girls were talking about, for example, when they were talking about their menstrual cycle, I would act like I felt uncomfortable about it, or about puberty or pubic hair or sex in general. I was almost playing a role, the somebody that you might see on a sitcom when I was growing up. And frankly, I didn't feel that way. And in fact, it was my wife who a few years ago said to me, "What are you doing? You're doing this thing to our children that you don't need to do." And I don't even I don't think you feel that way about it. There's a great quote by Mr. Rogers that says, "Anything that is human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be made better if we talk about it." So there's a lot of shame around sex. There's a lot of shame around body parts. There's a lot of shame around natural human development. And we think that this shame will protect children from acting out in ways that could be dangerous or could be harmful for their psychological development. And just like a lot of things, there are ways to talk about it. There are ways to set boundaries around it. But what it comes down to, just like in my own story that I just told you, is we have to look at our own upbringing. We have to look at our own shame. We have to look at the roots of the messages that we pass on to our children. I don't think a lot of this stuff is intuitive. I think it's something you have to learn and practice and spend some time with. And so in Western civilization, we have a tradition around sex that has lasted for hundreds of years. And while it is evolving and opening up, it is still there. And there can become, we understand from psychology, there can become kind of a perversion around sex when the message isn't clear, when it's filled with shame. People can act out in the dark, right? They can act out in secret in ways that can be harmful. They can become obsessed or even develop addictions around behaviors because of shame. And so while they might be compulsively, for example, masturbating or looking at pornography, we think of that as too much sex. But really, like a lot of behaviors, those kinds of behaviors have their roots in shame. It's really a strange kind of thing that people that are hypersexual or might be incredibly aggressive or seem to lack empathy, that underneath that, a few layers, there were messages that were overwhelming to them about fear and shame and guilt. And so, yes, I don't think sex in our society deserves or has any kind of unique position around shame, except for to say that in Western civilization that is a common theme. And we could talk about where it comes from culturally and religiously. But it takes us It takes a conscious effort on all of our parts to explore our own shame and our own roots, our own upbringing, to to challenge the context, to have a conversation with a therapist or with a support group where we come to realize that the message, this is really important, the messages that we grew up with weren't necessarily the truth. That the construct, the idea, the context that we grew up with was contrived. And that sometimes we learn that by visiting other cultures, by visiting Europe, for example. There's a different sensibility around sexuality. I remember when I visited Samoa a few years back, and there was a kind of a third gender part of the population that was very natural and talked about, very open, which was really predated a lot of my exposure in the United States to transgendered people. So sometimes visiting other larger cultures helps us expose the idea that what we believe is not necessarily the truth. That one allows it by exposing oneself to other ideas, which can be as simple as a therapist and as large as visiting other countries. We begin to notice that the constructions or the ideas that we have are noticeable and that we can deconstruct them. So, yes, shame in Western civilization in the United States around sex is rampant. I've participated in it both as a child and as a parent. And it took my wife's clear message to me that I was playing a role. I was becoming a caricature of something that I didn't believe because I was just passing on the behavior, responding to ideas around sex and gender the same way that I'd been taught in the culture growing up. All right. Someone says, do you have more clients' kids during COVID that have reacted or need therapy due to their parents' increased drinking? Not necessarily. We haven't noticed that. It's an interesting, COVID has been an interesting thing because there seems to be an equal number of people that are afraid to send their children to wilderness as those that find that it might be the best intervention. And I find that fascinating because wilderness therapy is virtually the safest place that you can be. It's an incredibly monitored and contained group of people with very little interaction to anybody in the outside world except for people dropping off supplies or the therapist and the staff changing once a week. And of course, being outdoors is one of the things that's recommended, not being inside and in enclosed places. And so, but I find even just this week, there were a couple of families that were inquiring about our program that felt anxious about their child being away, which I found to be fascinating. And I think it's because it's this kind of undefined anxiety that we're all feeling. You know, I've talked about this since the pandemic began, that everybody is experiencing moderate levels of trauma and limited emotional resources, tools, outlets, escapes, healthy escapes. I was telling my wife just the other day that I've kind of been dealing with this low-grade depression since the beginning of January, or excuse me, the beginning of July this year. And as I was telling her this weekend, I think it's just a matter of energy out and energy in. You know, I have a lot of energy that goes out in the course of my work week and mostly sitting in this chair talking to employees or prospective parents or clients or therapists. And then I don't have a lot of energy coming in. And the old places that I used to go to kind of relax and let go aren't available to me anymore. And so I think that untreated anxiety, which is kind of a cousin to depression, that untreated sense of unwellness, I think can be translated in a parenting decision with just a fear of change, a fear of taking a risk. You know, the parents that I've talked to that are looking at our program are worried that their child will be far away when And in one respect, their child will be much, much safer with us. And so will they, as a matter of fact, when they're in our program. So we haven't had that specific problem. Um, and it's about 50-50. Half of the people see it as an obvious solution to some of the dynamics of being at home, school online, children's mood and mental health issues, family being kind of compressed together. And then equally, we have just as many people who are entertaining or exploring the idea of wilderness therapy, but are genuinely anxious, and that general anxiety gets kind of focused into not making a decision, which rationally would be a safer decision. Okay, somebody wrote in from when I did the existential webinar, which was my last webinar. They wrote, "I love this topic. Thank you for this. Can you talk about more about who are you?" Through this work, I've realized that I don't identify as much with my previous definition of who I am, my roles, my interests, my hobbies, etc., my job. I am working to define this for myself, asking myself, what do I want? Exploring ideas of flow and bliss. Can you share an example of how an enlightened person would answer this? If you haven't watched Finding Joe, I strongly recommend it. Finding Joe is a documentary based on the work of Joseph Campbell, a mythologist, a philosopher that Evoke borrows heavily upon in our curriculum and the work that we do with people. Joseph Campbell was somebody who studied all of the world's myths, all throughout all time, across all cultures, and came up with this central story that he called the hero's journey or the hero's adventure. This kind of common algorithm, this pattern that you could see in all of it. And most storytellers, most filmmakers are aware of this. I say this all the time, but George Lucas based Star Wars on Joseph Campbell's work, on his principal work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which was his seminal work in developing this idea. But anyway, there's a point in there where they explain Joseph Campbell's idea that there are this Eastern philosophy, religious idea about ways into enlightenment. And he talked about the first couple of ways of enlightenment is to know your being, know who you are. And they have the first two examples, pathways have very subtle distinctions. But then he said the third pathway is knowing your bliss. Bliss becomes a pathway into enlightenment. It's as simple as do something that brings you joy and meaning. Find something that gives you joy and meaning and do more of that. And so Campbell said, I don't know if I can know my beingness or completely know who I am. But I think I can find my bliss. I think I can find that thing that hours go by like minutes. That thing that as a child made me stand out and feel like I didn't fit in. That thing that gives me the greatest sense of purpose and meaning in my life. It's not just pleasure. Bliss is not just hedonistic sensory pleasure, but it's something it's a deeper, more profound sense of purpose. So, a lot of background to kind of respond to your answer. I've come to adopt that idea. I don't know how to figure out the edges of myself. Meditation can help, of course, therapy can help. But for me, part of it is finding out what I really love to do, how I really love to spend my time, people that I really love to be around and feel supported by, and do more of those things and spend more time around those people. As I've gotten older on this journey, I find that I don't want to waste my time around people who can't support me, support who I am. And that I'm less willing to make sacrifices and compromises around that. And I think of therapy, the reason that I love therapy so much is because for me, I found a therapist where I can be me, I can experiment with who I am. And she just provides this safe, consistent container for me. She, she, as they say, holds space for it. And I get to kind of explore and see what fit. It's like I go into therapy and I'm trying on outfit after outfit after outfit. And she's a mirror. And I figure out which one suits me the best. So, borrowing from Campbell, kind of leaning into therapy in my own experience, my idea, and it doesn't have to be the idea, is that spend time around, spend time doing and around people who bring you joy and a sense of meaning. I think the scariest thing that happens in this journey is that we I talk about the three keys to enlightenment and the audacity to be you. And I think it's the last one. So this is almost the very end of my book where I say, learn to die over and over again. New beliefs, new relationships, new contexts. And I think that that's what happens in this work. Old conversations, getting, losing and grieving and moving on from old relationships that don't fit anymore. And if you grew up in a strict father family or an alcoholic family, those are terms that don't necessarily mean literally strict father and literally alcoholic, but kind of rigid, closed systems. If you grew up in those kinds of systems, you have a tendency to remain loyal to people because of things that they've done for you in the past. That even if today it doesn't suit you because you've grown or just doesn't fit with your sensibility, that you owe it to them somehow. I think one of the beautiful parts about inner child work is to imagine the child inside of you and paying attention to what you owe to them, what you owe to you. So, that's my roundabout answer to the existential question about finding your beingness. Somebody asked the question, how do we know if a pursuits trip between wilderness and aftercare is a good idea for our family? Things are very strained, and we want to make sure that this would not trigger and cause a setback. Can you also talk about the difference between a pursuit and a family walkabout? I'll start with the last part of the question. A family walkabout is you visiting the field, and it's got no frills. It's within the context of our program. And typically the student goes back into the group. So that's a family walkabout. It's basically you're doing wilderness therapy with your kid. Right? You're really participating in essentially the exact same program that they do. Pursuits is a completely separate program, run by separate people. It's under the Evoke larger umbrella, but it's a completely separate department with separate staff, separate activities. So it can involve fly fishing. It could involve simply camping. It can involve whitewater rafting. It can involve horseback riding, rappelling, anything. It could be international or it could be anywhere in the United States. So it's meant to kind of be an adventure program, whereas a walkabout is working within the context of the wilderness therapy program. We've been introducing the idea of a walkabout over the last few months. We've been introducing the idea of a pursuits trip as an option in between because we're limiting exposure from outside folks to our wilderness program. So walkabouts aren't available right now during the pandemic. And I've been hesitant to suggest the pursuits because it's a bigger production, right? And it costs more time and resources for you and for us. And so we're careful to recommend that, but it can be an option if you have the time and the money to do it, to do something interesting. In terms of whether or not your family is available, it's the same as all of the things. Let's imagine that COVID was gone, didn't exist, or was cured. You would still be asking your Evoke therapist what that transition should look like. And the traditional model would be you would come out to the field, excuse me. You would come out to the field in the group that your child is in for a couple of days and spend time with the group and the staff, the peers, and your child in the group, camping with your child. I did it as a father when my son was in wilderness therapy. And then you would typically leave with your child and as efficiently as possible transport them to the next program. That's the standard end of program, transition program kind of model that we've used for many, many years. Now, with this part of the process, with COVID here, since that's not available, what you can do is you can do a pursuits trip. You can design it. You can ask for certain activities, location, so forth, come up with a budget and do something. These are ex-wilderness therapy staff, former wilderness therapy staff of ours, and some come from other places too. You can have a therapist involved at some level, depending upon the need, but you're going to ask your therapist at Evoke the same question. Is this the right thing for us? And they may say no. I'm just going to speak anecdotally. About 25% of my families, maybe that's a little high, maybe about 20% of my families pre-COVID, I wouldn't recommend for them to transport their child to the next program. We would just do it for them because things were so volatile or raw or strained, like you say. So it's the exact same process. You ask your wilderness therapist where you're at, present the idea of a pursuits as a possibility, and see what their feedback. You still have the safety net of staff that are experienced in communication and problem solving, therapeutic processing and support. So you still have that. If any of you have been on a pursuits trip in between the program, if any of you in attendance have been on one and you want to share a sentence or two, I'll go back to that and share that with you. But that's kind of the answer. That's kind of the landscape. Somebody asked the question, when do you recommend parent coaching? We are working with a therapist at home. Just curious when more is needed. The parent coaching and therapy are really a lot of overlap. Coaching typically will be more directive, right? Now, I say it will be more directive, but then I have to change that a little bit because Evoke's philosophy is to help you discover what are the blockages to your awareness, to your insight. And so we don't think of ourselves as directive as a program. Evoke Therapy Programs has a pool of therapeutic coaches. We have one. It's on the website. You can go there. They are trained in the attachment-based model of Evoke Therapy's model, our model, the model that I talk to you folks about all the time on these broadcasts. And so if you come with a question like, should I take them home? Should I set curfew at 10 o'clock? What should I do on the behavioral contract? The Evoke coach is going to respond to you more like a traditional therapist. They're not going to advise you or tell you what to do. It's just part of what we believe. We would rather, it's the old adage of teaching you how to fish versus giving you a fish. We would rather have you develop the thought processes, the sensibility to be able to think your way through it so that when something new happens or the circumstances change by 10 or 15%, you're able to adjust because now you're thinking differently. So our version of parent coaching that we do, that I subscribe to, that we recommend when people ask for it, is a lot more like the philosophy at Evoke that you hear about on all of these podcasts. It's about deeper awareness. It's about what I talk about in the journey of the heroic parent, that it's about teaching you to become your own expert, giving you new eyes and ears to hear and see your child in a new way, to see symptoms in a new way, to see parenting problems and blocks in a new way. And we believe that in the long run, this will serve you better, will empower you more, and it will give you a greater sense of peace because there's something so temporary about taking advice from the latest expert. And advice change and circumstances change. So we believe in something much deeper than that. We believe in an attachment-based model. Somebody says, can you please recommend a book on anxiety in adolescence for a parent to read? I saw that question just a moment ago when I was answering, and I'm not, one's not coming to mind. I'm at a loss for words right now, which of course, as you know, if you listen, doesn't happen very often. Maybe take down the name, Malia, and let me, once we're done with the broadcast, I'll send out some recommendations. Someone says, my son came home from Evoke about 10 weeks ago, and after adjusting to being home, he is doing really well. Sending him to Evoke has been the best decision as parents we've ever made. However, I can't get over the guilt of having my son kidnapped out of his bed and transported. He doesn't struggle with this, but I do. Any advice on this topic? Thank you. Well, you might chuckle at this, but guilt is the problem itself. I think was it FDR that said there's nothing to fear except fear itself? I think it was FDR who said that. And guilt is my goal in working with parents and clients is to get rid of all guilt. If you've heard me talk about this, and I wrote about this in the journey of the rogue parent, guilt is not associated with morality. It's just not. Everybody here can think of an example of something that they would feel guilty for if they did, and that was the right thing. So guilt is the twisted idea, and guilt comes from family of origin and societal programming, but principally family of origin programming. So guilt is the problem. Guilt is something to eradicate, to get rid of, to learn how to exercise, and to go back to the origins, right? See, here's the thing. Our parents did the best that they could, and it wasn't that great. It was just human. And they thought that feeling guilt was the way to keep you on track, to keep you on course. They didn't know that guilt was going to ruin your life. They didn't know it had ruined their life. They didn't know that guilt was going to constantly be up against doing the right thing, that you were going to be constantly challenged to do the right thing and feel the guilt anyway. They had no idea. And so what they taught you was this kind of undifferentiated idea that if you hurt somebody, upset somebody, disappointed somebody, that you did something wrong. That's nonsense. That's inane. Everybody knows that. Everybody listening to me knows that you simply cannot measure right and wrong by whether or not you hurt somebody. Because if that were true, it's the very thing that handicaps parents in parenting. It's the very thing that doesn't allow a girl to say to her boyfriend, I don't want to have sex. It's the very thing that tells a young man that he's not going to go out and party with his friends. They'll be disappointed or upset. It's the very thing that prevents you from setting boundaries. I mean, think about that. It's the very thing that prevents you from setting healthy boundaries, which, by the way, will benefit you and the child in the long run. So guilt is one of the great mistakes in society. And we evolve to love, to empathy, to compassion, to non-judgment. Not just non-judgment for others, but non-judgment for ourselves. So the problem is the guilt. The fact that it's specifically associated with you transporting your child, we could deconstruct that idea. You've probably heard all of the comments. I wrote a blog on it. If you want to Google my name, in fact, you could probably do this, Malia, and share the link. Just Google Brad Reedy transport. You will find the blog. And then read that. The research shows us that there's no difference in outcomes. And my own anecdotal experience tells me it's a more humane way to transport a child. But we've been taught that we can't betray our children or cause them to feel sad or upset We can't tell that to our boyfriend, to our girlfriend, to our colleague, to our parents. Guilt is toxic. It's just as toxic as shame, and I think it's more insidious because there are people, famous self-help people, who still teach us that guilt is associated with morality, and that's a lie. Guilt is an unreliable source for moral development, and it is universally an issue that I deal with folks in therapy, adults, parents in therapy, that they have to learn to do the right thing and feel the guilt anyway, until after a while they can learn to eventually get rid of that instinct to feel guilty for things they were taught to feel guilty about. I've told the story many times about my mother coming to me and saying, I think I should start to feel guilty for some of the ways that I raised you. And I said to her, it would be nice if you realized your mistakes. It would be nice for you. It'd be a gift to me and my brother. But guilt isn't necessary. In fact, guilt will get in the way of you becoming aware of your mistakes. Guilt will get in the way of you becoming aware of your mistakes. So you first have to deconstruct the entire idea around guilt that is universal, not just in our culture, but in many cultures. Somebody said, can you talk about the pros and cons of in-person versus virtual intensives? Listening to a recent podcast interview with Travis, our new clinical director, you mentioned that some aspects of the virtual are actually better. Can you talk about this? Are you seeing advantages beyond cost, accessibility? Are you seeing virtual intensives as effective as in person? I think the biggest advantages to virtual is cost and resources. That's clearly the biggest advantage. Period. And a tremendous amount of work gets done. I think there's something about the in-person that is more full and complete. If I had to compare the two, I would say that the in-person is more desirable for me. It's a lot more work for me and the therapist because it's longer. Really, it's kind of a more communal feeling. We try to recreate that with leaving the Zoom open during breaks with the virtual ones, but there's something richer about the in-person. But I am incredibly satisfied and impressed with the virtual. And I would recommend that to my own family member, to my own children, to my own brothers, anybody struggling. It's a wonderful option given the limitations. And if money and time are a factor, which practically, matter of fact, they are for people a factor, then it's an excellent option because it's significantly less expensive for you, both for travel, the time that you have to afford to it, and they're just less expensive because we're spending less resources on them. All right, Malia's listed the transport blog link that I mentioned earlier, so you can click on that. No other questions. So we have a wellness program. We have parent coaching or coaching. Doesn't have to be parent coaching, by the way. See, my philosophy is you can come for parent questions, but I remember when my book first came out, I was in New York doing an event, and somebody said about my first book, they said, tell me about your parenting philosophy. And I said, it's not really a parenting book. In fact, the parenting aspect of it is just ancillary. It's important. It's what gets you into the book, but it's about you. And that's why the second book, I felt the need for it urgently because I didn't want to lose an audience who thought that I'm a parent educator. I do talk to parents. That's the context of you and I getting together on these. But this stuff applies to your marriage, to your friendships, to your parents and you, to your siblings, to your career, to your own anxiety, your own relationship to yourself, on and on and on. So it's all the same kind of work when you do it this way. And those of you who have done some of the work know that, because you take these principles and you apply them across the board in your lives. Somebody just weighed in on an intensive. Somebody said, I am grateful for the online intensive I participated in. It was powerful and less intimidating. I think I was able to dive in faster because it was virtual. I highly recommend. Somebody says, thank you for sharing that. If we do not receive a letter from our son, can you give us some guidance on writing him? Okay, I have a podcast and a webinar on that, so you can go to that. But here's the thoughts. Here's what you respond to or what you write about. You write about what you're hearing the therapist at Evoke talk about. I talked to Brad this week. I talked to Phil or Malia or Matt or Travis this week, or Judith. This is what they're saying. Here's my reaction. Here's my thoughts. So you're responding to the update. You're responding to the letter, but you said you didn't get one, so you don't have that. And then you're talking about your own life, your own work, what's going on for you. Some of you know, I've said this many times. My son was in wilderness for 16 weeks, and I found it challenging to write as the weeks went on. And sometimes my letters weren't that long, and sometimes my letters were newsy. So unless the therapist gives you a specific directive because they're trying to accomplish something very specific, the basic premise of writing letters, when I talk about it, is write a bad letter, blow it, make a mistake. And what I am humorously trying to suggest is you can't get it right anyway. You just respond with what comes natural, what's your truth. If I were writing my son this week, some of you might know because you might follow me on social media, I am a big sports fan and a huge Los Angeles Lakers fan. So is my family. So last night we had a big celebration and a big barbecue and party with my children, all of my children that aren't away at college. And we had a great time, and I would write about that this week. I would write about my struggles with anxiety and depression since July 1st. I would write that I just got back on the wagon with exercising and I'm feeling really good. I could just write about my life. So I hope that helps. I don't have all of the follow-up slides tonight, so I'm not going to go through all of that. Suffice to say that all of these are available on your favorite podcast app. Finding You in Evoke Therapy podcast. We have the pursuits, as I mentioned, the wilderness. We also have the parent or just the coaching. We're on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We also have an Evoke Family Foundation. Just go to evokefamilyfoundation.org if you want to give back or you want to become involved in raising money for people who can't afford therapy. Someone who writes, I have a question. My son was in the program several years ago, and while it's obvious that he gained so much and is basically a different child, and so is our relationship, he still says it was a traumatic experience and it was abusive in a sense. He started to write a book about this experience. Why does he still feel the need to deny the positive gain? Pardon typos. I'm writing without my glasses. I think I made it through your typos. My guess is he needs to tell somebody and feels like he's listened to. When we parent and we make the best choices that we can, given the knowledge and the resources that we have, it's important just to allow our kids to think that we did a crappy job, to say we're sorry, to ask them to tell us about it. See, in your question, there you can feel, although it's gentle, it's very gentle, an energy around trying to get him to remember the positives. And he can sense that too. So he wants to write a book to people that will read it and relate to it, not to a father or a mother who will try to remind him that it was positive. So the thinking is that he wants to write it because he wants it to be heard and validated. So when my children come to me, ideally, I'm speaking ideally, on my good days, and they get mad at me for something I did as a parent, even if in my mind it was the best I could have done and I would do it again, my response is, I'm sorry. Thanks for telling me. I get it. It makes sense, right? We let them be mad at us for being human. And we try to let go of the agenda of being good and right. And then they just get to be a person too. And then they develop a sense of self. It all comes back to that. So let your children think that you're a loser. Let them think you're an idiot. And get that the need for validation from somebody else, from somewhere else, from me, from a therapist at home, from a book that you read, from a blog, from a podcast, from wherever your sources are, from a trusted friend, a mentor, a sponsor. Get your source of validation from those folks so that when you show up to the child, they can be their real self, their authentic self, and tell you how it was really hard. You know, it's not easy to be Brad Reedy's child, not because I'm a perfect parent and I wrote a book on parenting, but because I have character flaws that are a pain. I'm intense. I take a lot of space. I can be reactive, right? A lot of things. And my children need to tell somebody, and I'd like it to be me. I mean, my favorite thing would be if they could tell me what a jerk I've been. That would be the best. Then I get to have a relationship with who they are. And if I've done enough work that I'm okay with who I am, I can be there for them in that. So that's my guess. Let them feel it. Encourage him to write it. Sit down with him and ask him if he'll tell you all about it. And listen with a deep, compassionate, empathic listening ear. All right, is that all the questions for today? Thanks for joining us, folks. I hope these are helpful points of contact for you. Thank you so much for your interest and involvement in your own work. Thank you for and on behalf of your child. And this is the narrow path. This is the road less traveled. You're looking at yourself, and that's the heroic journey. The heroic journey is realizing that all of the devils that are worth fighting are in here, inside your head, and that the problem isn't out there, but in here, inside of you. That's the hero's journey. That's what the stories and the myths are trying to tell us over and over and over again. So thank you for being on this with us. And I hope this is a helpful point of contact. And I'll talk to you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.